Morning. Coming up over the next few weeks, we have some different sort of services happen. If anyone here knows Andrew Wiens, now Pastor Andrew Wiens, I remember him as a youth leader here. He had a lot of history here. He's going to come back and share our conclusion of the Beatitudes. I'm kind of excited about that, and we'll be leading communion next week. Following that, Dave Weeb is going to speak on dwelling in the comma. I always like when a sermon series ends and another one doesn't start yet, because you can pretty much do anything you want. So I'm excited about what he's going to do. And September 8th, you have not heard about this, minus a few of us, because planning has been complicated, but we're going to do a kickoff. We're going to start with a carnival again. We're going to do a bunch of things to engage our community and be excited. So don't be surprised next week when you hear us pleading up here frantically for help. There's been some challenges. Money is down in our church, and over the summer it's really hard to plan things. But a bunch of us feel it's time to stop looking back and start looking forward. So we're excited about what's to come. Speaking of that, I have some questions for you guys today. The first question is, how would you like to be known and remembered? So I invite you, if you wish, close your eyes, sit back while I ask a series of questions, and let me know, do any of these resonate with you? Actually, don't let me know, because some of them are pretty negative, and if that one resonates, we can talk about that later. How would you like to be known and remembered? As a Christian who loves people? As a person who fed the hungry and helped those with less? As a person who's unfriendly and angry all the time? As a person who helped newly married people fix their roof? As a person playing in the back with children on a Sunday, so an exhausted mom or dad, which we have many of them here, can have a break for an hour. As a person who loved their neighbor, who is just crusty to them all the time. As a person who stole and ripped people off their whole life and caused damage. As a person who is selfish or greedy. As a person who is a caring parent. As a person who inspired people to do and be better in their lives. How would you like to be known and remembered? That's a question I often ask myself, and it's really hard to answer. I would say if you don't have any perception of what that might be, how people might view you and how you live your life, you can simply ask a friend, a spouse, or coworker, someone that would be honest with you about how you want to be remembered. Trouble is, many people don't understand that what we say we believe and how we act it out are often different. How we live out our life really matters, and it doesn't always line up with our words. Plenty of people say they love Jesus and people on a Sunday, but it never penetrates their hearts. It never creates that place of behavioral change for during the week, and we live in that place. Now, I want you to think back in a time when you were really faking it. When you didn't want someone to really see who you were or see how you felt. It could be lying or trying to make someone feel better, but think of a time when you were faking it for a moment. It can be easy to maintain our composure when we're calm, when things are going really, really well for us. But when things start to go badly, we start to get agitated and we lose our cool. When things are tough and not going our way, and then that opportunity presents itself. You know the type I'm talking about? Where you have the chance to make your life way easier, but it involves letting go of your integrity or some of your moral choices for a little bit. Well, maybe a lot. I'd like Kathy to come up here and read for a moment of time of David's life before he was king, when he did really well.
So this has a subtitle and it says, David spares Saul's life. And that's pretty important, just that line, but I'll read the whole thing Terry asked me to read. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, so Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far in the back of the cave. The men said, "This is the day that the Lord spoke, when he'll give him over to you. I will give your enemy into your hand for you to deal with as you wish." David crept up unnoticed and cut the corner of Saul's robe. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off the corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is anointed of the Lord." With this word, David sharply rebuked his men, and he did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Then David went out and called out to Saul, "My lord, the king." When Saul turned around and looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed.' See, my father, look at this piece of your robe I have in my hand. I cut the corner off, but I didn't kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil, so my hand will not touch you."
Thank you, Kathy. I should mention that a couple chapters further on, there's a similar story where David has a second chance. He sneaks into the camp with a bunch of his men, and he takes Saul's spear and his drinking water pot and has an opportunity to kill him again, and again doesn't. So just to point that one out. To say that David and Saul's relationship was complicated is saying very little. Saul was the ordained king of Israel for a long time. God ordained him, and he was constantly plagued with evil spirits. He had a fantastic habit of making very, very poor choices. What did relieve his torment in these spirits was the music David would play. Saul would feel the Spirit of God while David played, and he'd be calmed for a while. He felt at peace and he felt at rest, at least for a little bit. Then the spirits would come back and he would do things like throw spears or try to set a trap for David and try to kill him. They had a very complicated relationship. I don't think it helped that Saul's son Jonathan was also David's best friend. That seemed to make him angrier and angrier. Also, the fact that David seemed to be everyone's favorite and Saul was not continued this tension. This brings us to the passage that Kathy just read about the love-hate relationship between Saul and David. It's important to note that God sent Samuel quite a while before to anoint David as Israel's next king. This is the same Samuel that anointed Saul years before. So remember when we talked about this chance presents itself. You get a chance to make your life a lot easier if you do one simple act. He had a choice. He can get rid of the man trying to kill him, which would make his life way easier. He would also instantly become king because he was anointed to be the next king. And on top of that, he would be a way better king possibly. Saul wasn't doing the greatest job. In fact, he was creating quite a bit of damage. You ever think when you're reading the Bible, what would I do in this situation? If I was David, would I have killed Saul in that moment, have taken my place? It seemed to be the men around him felt that this is God's call on him. This is your chance. God's put this in your way. Today we're going to cover two Beatitudes out of Matthew 5, out of 9 and 10. It said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Today's story, it's easy to tell how David's being persecuted. He's being chased by Saul and these 3,000 men, and they're trying to kill him. Now, I don't know how many men David had with him, but I'm guessing it wasn't a fair fight, that he was in quite a bit of trouble. It is also easy to see where he's being persecuted. The chasing of him was a really, really hard place. It's also easy to see how he was a peacemaker. He chose not to harm Saul when he had the opportunity. He chose a place of peace and integrity when he didn't have to. Now, I should point out at this point that if you know David well in the Bible, he didn't always make wise choices. There's lots of accounts that he did not live his life as a peacemaker or as one that was being persecuted. In fact, he persecuted quite a bit. If you're looking for these accounts, David, Bathsheba, Uriah, they're a good place to start because he did some pretty nasty things in there. But for today, I want to stay with the example of where he did really well. The question I always ask myself is, what would God like us to learn or rethink about the story we're reading? First, we have the idea of us being peacemakers. My first question is, what is peace and how does it make sense within this passage? To start the conversation, let's talk about what the difference is between having a truce and peace is. A truce, whether in an argument, a battle, or other conflicts, is choosing to stop fighting for a little while. It's choosing not to take shots at each other, whether physically bullets or yelling at each other, for a period of time. But it's not seeking to stop the conflict. It's only seeking to lessen the damage done in the moment. Most of the time, the battle continues, and at the end of the truce, people have taken time to regroup, find more ammunition, whether words or bullets, and they've taken the time to let the conflict boil and brew inside them where they're actually angrier and more frustrated. So truce doesn't resolve anything long term. Peace, on the other hand, seeks truth. It seeks to do the hard work of finding common ground and attempting to understand each other's positions. The kind of Christian peace doesn't seek to gloss over or evade the hard conversations in a conflict. It's actually looking for a resolution. It's doing the much harder work than slinging bullets at each other. It's looking for common ground. Jesus in his message here didn't ask us to be peacekeepers. The idea of a peacekeeper is a force or an individual that's usually stronger, has more resources, and in a position of power. They have the ability to create a situation where people must stop taking jabs at each other for a while. I get the idea of a group like the United Nations where they come into a conflict and they step in and force people to behave themselves to some degree. They have more soldiers, more guns, more influence. They can do things like stop trade with the country or withholding support. So they have a way of making them stop shooting each other for a moment. While this might cause less damage to the people and property, this is really just a forced truce. The people are still in conflict. They're still looking for a way to harm and damage each other. And they're looking for what they can get away with, what lines they can cross, which they can't, or at least not get caught crossing lines too much. But Jesus does not do the things that we expect. Usually he wants us to make a much harder choice and do a much harder way of road, and a way more impactful road. You notice the wording in Matthew 5, we're not called to be peacekeepers in our world. We're called to be peacemakers. We don't come from a position of power. We don't come from a position of influence, but we come from a position of understanding or trying to and walking alongside people. The difference is peacekeeping looks at the effect of a conflict and how we can minimize the damage and solve it for a moment. Peacemaking looks at the root of a conflict and does the hard work of trying to come to a true resolution to try to solve it for all parties. Peacemaking is not passive. It's not evasive, but it seeks some hard answers. I do like reading John MacArthur sometimes. He's a minister out of the States, and he makes this comment. Being a peacemaker is not avoiding the issue. It's diving right into the middle of it and trying to bring about a righteous solution. And that's what we're called to. It's important to note that does not give us permission to go out looking for conflicts. We're not called to jump in the middle of every conflict we see and try to resolve it. Jesus calls us to be a people of peace. He also doesn't call us to be a people of pot stirring. Unless, of course, it's after lunch and we happen to be talking about the sermon, then have a great debate and report back to me. But normally, we're not supposed to do that pot stirring. In our church and our home life, we have more than enough conflicts that come our way. That if we practice peacemaking in those situations, we'll get good enough as it is without looking for more. And if we live our life as peacemakers, we'll be called the children of God. Is it just me, or is the concept of being a child of God really hard to get my head around? And for the rest of you. Have you ever considered what it means to be a child of God? The fact that God has a loving and personal relationship with you as an individual. Despite our weaknesses and our sin, He accepts us exactly the way we are. He forgives us and keeps on forgiving us constantly. He protects us, loves us, accepts us. Then He gives us the Holy Spirit to live inside us so we have the ability to be changed daily more into His likeness. I think that's what being a child of God looks like. God makes us an heir to everything He possesses. Can you even fathom that? God works everything for our good. He keeps us from perishing forever and gives us heaven and gives us a relationship with Him. And what's the price we have to pay for all this? Just accepting Him. If we accept Jesus as our Lord of our life and let God change us into the creations we're intended to be, that includes being more and more in His image. That's all He requires. That comes with a steep cost, but that'll be another message for another day. Being a peacemaker is not all that God requires of us. He wants to be proud of us as a child. He wants us to make good choices. The second part of the Beatitude we're talking today is about those that are persecuted because of their righteousness. For theirs will be the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's some gifts that we love receiving, but there's some that we could probably do without. I remember for a long time in our family, we had this wine bottle that someone pressed down into a cheese board that would circulate for many Christmases. I don't remember who stopped regifting or what happened to it, but none of us miss it. There's always some of those gifts in our life that if it vanished, it'd be okay. This is that sort of gift. John 15:18-19 says, "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were in the world must love its own. And because you are not in the world, I chose you out of this world. Because of this, the world hates you." That is basically saying because we love Jesus and because we're different, this world will hate us and what we stand for if we really stand for it. Christians ought to expect persecution. Jesus kind of promised that. He made that point clear in the Beatitudes and he re-emphasized it in John. Now, I think as we talk about persecution, there's two types I'd like to talk about as Christians here. The first is we take a stand for the gospel and the people, and then people around us see the foolishness and they start to hate us for the stand we've taken on so many things. When we're being persecuted for our right living, I think this is what the passage is talking about. And there's the one sometimes we do also, the second one. Sometimes we like to think we're being persecuted for our actions and the stands we take, but really sometimes we're just being jerks to people around us. And instead of being persecuted, they just don't like us for what we're saying and doing. There's a difference between standing out in response to the gospel and the truth that we feel, and standing out because we're trying to prove a point or just trying to stand out. There's a fine line between suffering for persecution and suffering for the consequences of our sin. I know for me, much of the suffering I've experienced and the rejection, as little as it is, has usually been because of my belief in Jesus. It doesn't necessarily mean the rejection I've endured is minimal. In fact, if I'm honest, I must admit there's times when I brought rejection about myself, not because of what I've said, but because of how I've said it. Let me be clear. Experiencing rejection for something you say is not the same as being persecuted for the same of Christ. Sometimes we say things in some of the most unloving and unkind ways, and that's really different. I'm not saying our convictions and beliefs in truth are wrong. In fact, they're very much right. Our distinctives as Christians are the things that set us apart, and they should. We need to hold on to our gospel beliefs and our convictions really solidly. How can you say Jesus is the only way to God and think you'd be popular with everyone in the world? As one example. There's things that we believe that create tension. The difference is often how we say things. Are we saying things in Christian love and truth to draw people into a loving relationship with God? Or are we speaking in a truth in a way that make them feel alienated, without hope, hated, unloved? That's why it's important on how we say as much as the message we say. Jesus said some very hard things. If you read through the Gospels, he said some really painful things to many people. But he always said in a loving way and looking to include, not exclude. He sought to reunite people with the Father, knowing the Father would create the change in attitudes and lifestyles that they needed, not necessarily his words in the moment. All that said, I found this quote quite a while ago, and forgive me if I don't remember where it's from. I should probably put a little more work into that. But here it is regardless. If you're living the kind of life the world can comfortably ignore, you need to question whether you're living up to the standard Christ described in the Beatitudes. Not every believer will be chased out of his or her town with torches and pitchforks, and we don't want to intentionally irritate or provoke the wrath of an unbelieving world. But if you fit seamlessly into secular society, you need to consider what the testimony of your life says to others about your relationship with Christ, or if it says anything at all. For me, that was really convicting. Do I fit in where no one notices I'm a Christian, or do I stand out a little bit? Now, if you remember back to my initial question about how do you want to be remembered, David in this passage was remembered for something pretty great. He showed grace. And there's lots of places where we're not. Part of the question also needs to be not how we're remembered, but how different people will remember us. What do your friends, family, co-workers, your community have to say about you when you're not around? How about Jesus? What might he say about you and what you do on this world? Now, I've said it a few times. One of my favorite Bible stories is of Stephen in Acts. I love the picture in my head I get based on a song from the 80s, which of course is dating myself again. Way back then, there was a guy named Ray Boltz that sang a song, Someone Stood Up for Stephen. It gives a picture of Stephen, let's get it right, standing up for Jesus and being stoned to death for his actions in his stand. This is followed by the image in the song of Jesus standing up before the Father in heaven and speaking up out boldly for him. This idea always gives a strong impression of me. I ask questions of myself like, would Jesus be proud of who I am in my life right now? Or would he turn his head a little bit? What does he say to the Father when he looks at us? Being persecuted for our faith doesn't often mean dying for our faith in Canada. But living it out each day should have a cost of some sort. As I hope you picked up from our series in the Beatitudes this summer, this part of Scripture is all about the attitudes we have and the behaviors we have, the way we live out our Scripture in our daily Christian life. I would say this is true of much of Scripture, but especially within this passage. If we can understand the truth of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, it should lead us want to change who we are. I can picture Stephen here and so many others who were rejected and killed and persecuted for their faith. They get to stand before God and hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." I think that would be all of our wishes. The joy of eternity in heaven with Jesus is the gift we receive that is truly his love and the acceptance of Jesus here on earth. But the price is the suffering we have to face. Again, it might not be death, but we have something to go through if we want to take a stand. I find it incredibly ironic within this whole conversation that Jesus, who is God, and who had the power to stop all the conflicts, to stop everything, he was the one that was persecuted so strongly and murdered for us. He could have changed everything, but he didn't. He chose to go through that. Now, ironic was not the correct word, and I'm not sure what it is. But Jesus had a fantastic way of teaching people that when we're presented with two choices, there's often a third. And that would often be a way that's way outside the box and would shock everyone around him. In the place of conflict, Jesus had worked to make peace. True, it was not always embraced or welcomed. In fact, many people rejected it. But it was his aim to speak truth and undo so much of the spiritual oppression that was on the people at the time. Their system wasn't always a good one, much like ours at times. Jesus felt the persecution from the religious leaders who challenged him constantly, even to the point where they killed him because of it. So in our realities, this is what we face. We do face persecution. We face conflicts. We face lots of things in our world. At the very back, you'll find a nice little list of 9 items I'm going to go through. So if you're one that likes to scramble and write, you don't have to. Nor did I put it on PowerPoint so you can scramble and write. Just pick up a piece of paper. What can we do about this today? First, I think we need to look inside ourselves. If we don't live at peace with ourselves, we can never bring peace to the world around us. If we have a negative attitude or think others are always against us, it's impossible to see clearly into any conflict or any situation. Number 2, we can learn to be better listeners. I know I suffer from that. It's very hard to be present at times. If we learn to listen to understand, not just planning out our reply and our rebuke, while it can be satisfying to verbally win an argument, it doesn't lead to understanding each other. Number 3, if we're generally interested in other people, if we want to understand and get to know them better, it's hard to dismiss or reject them and their ideas once we get to know them. The more distant we are from someone, the easier it is to reject them. Number 4, understand that conflict isn't bad. Most of the time, conflict is due to lack of communication or really poor communication or understandings. When we seek to understand each other and not make all sorts of assumptions, both parties often find freedom in that moment. It's amazing what just having a conversation can do to narrow that chasm that grows between us. Number 5, put things into perspective. I still remember a really big argument I had a long time ago. I got into the car absolutely furious, and then I turned on the radio and was hearing all the accounts of 9/11 at the time. My perspective instantly changed. What's my conflict? The stupidity of it all, in the midst of all the suffering in the world around me. Sometimes just the perspective will change it. Number 6, look at your blessings. Too often we focus on the one negative situation or the one negative person that's bringing this conflict to us. And we don't see all the good that they're doing or the good that's happening through them. We can alienate them because of that one experience. Number 7, remain curious. I've worked my way through so many conflicts and questions in my office with people by simply asking questions. It's amazing as you remain curious and you ask questions, how light comes to things. And then all of a sudden you realize the conflict that you're having isn't actually it. So often it's a misunderstanding. And for me, I get to always learn more about myself as I'm being curious. As I get to know other people, I get to learn about myself. Number 8, surrender your ego. This is likely the hardest thing to do because we all like to be right. Often we have a right to feel wronged or hurt in a situation. But when our ego takes the lead in our conversation, we always respond from a place of fear, from anxiety, not from a place of curiosity. So we must learn to put our ego at rest daily. Forgive. If we build a habit of forgiving others and ourselves quickly, we get to live in freedom. Too often we allow unforgiveness to fester and build in ourselves, and really we're the ones that lose out of it. And I lied to you all, I have 10. I forgot I added one last night. Actually I had number 7, but 10 is, lastly and likely the hardest, take the first step and seek to go meet with the person. Instead of waiting for them to approach you, even if they've harmed you, go and talk to the person. Look to resolve the hurt. Because if we're waiting for everyone else to take the lead, it'll never happen. The onus is on us as Christians to make things right. Thanks.